All right, so good afternoon, everybody. My name is Jesse, and I am with Exploring by the Seat of Your Pants. If you're joining us for the first time, we are all about bringing conservation, adventure, and science into classrooms around the world. And I want to say a huge thank you again to all of our teachers. I know 2021's off to an odd start with a lot of changing schedules by the minute, so we really appreciate you tuning in live and on YouTube as we continue to celebrate and showcase such amazing people and places from across the globe. So today, I am particularly excited because today we continue our epic series with the Arctic Institute of North America. So they're based at the University of Calgary. We've done, I think, 10 programs with them now, featuring all sorts of stories about life in the North, what's going on in the Arctic and the changing Arctic. So if you want to check those out, they're all on our YouTube page. Today, we're going to talk about the story of the first Arctic peoples. So the Arctic is one of the most forbidding and unbelievable habitats in the entire world. How do people carve out a living there? And how did the first people to go there figure out how to survive in such a unique landscape? Well, we're going to find out with Dr. Patricia Wells. So I'm going to turn it over to her. Thank you so much for joining us today, Patricia, and take us away.
Thank you very much. It's my pleasure to be here and to talk to all these students from all over North America. And I'd say hello from Newfoundland and Labrador, where I am sitting out the COVID. I'm an archaeologist, and I study the first people who lived in the Arctic. And today I'd like to spend a little bit of time talking to you about the people. And I should add that I'm talking about the first people who lived in the North American and the Greenlandic part of the Arctic. It was a really special event when the people entered this area, because it was the last part of the planet that human beings occupied. And of course, it's the only, people also occupy Antarctica, but not in the same way. Antarctica has no communities with families. It has no sort of traditions that have developed locally in the Antarctic. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about the people who lived there and how they lived. And in the end, I'll just take a few moments to talk about Arctic dwellers who are living differently, but in many ways the same in a modern setting. So first of all, I want to define where the Arctic is, what I'm talking about with the Arctic. And so I'd like you to take a look at this map. Identify Greenland near the bottom left, then Canada, then you see Alaska, that part of the United States that is in the Arctic. And you see just right across that little narrow channel, the large country of Russia, then Finland, Sweden, Norway, and the various other islands. Now, a couple of things that are worth noticing is that the Arctic consists largely of an ocean, the Arctic Ocean. And it has some openings that allow it to pour out into the Pacific, which you see at the top of the screen. And the same waters pour out into the North Atlantic Ocean as well. This is a very productive ocean. So the Arctic is not the same in every one of these locations. Some areas there's more plant life than others, and it's not homogeneous. But generally, it's a cold place. In the summer, it's really rare for the temperatures to go above 15 centigrade or 60 degrees Fahrenheit. And in the winter, it goes down to often minus 35 degrees Celsius and even lower, and in Fahrenheit, I have it at about minus 20 Fahrenheit. During the winter, it's dark for much of the time, and in complete darkness for some days when the sun doesn't rise at all. In the summer, there are long days of sunlight, and in fact, in the summer, you'll have a number of days where the sun doesn't set at all. So now first of all, I just want to bring your attention back to that area between Alaska, the United States, and Russia. Now, we're going to have a little close-up of the same area. And in this map, I want you to notice that the dark brown regions are the places where there are land today. And the paler brown areas is where there had once been land. Beginning as early as 20,000 years ago, the world was a lot colder, and the water that was on the earth much of it existed as ice on the land, especially in mountains and also in the polar regions. So that meant that the sea level was much lower. And so land that is now underwater was once exposed. And this is called the Bering, this is today called the Bering Strait and the Bering Sea, but in the past that was land. And this was the basically the pathway for the first humans to move into the continents of North America and South America. So what did it look like at that time? While there were still big ice fields in the Bering area, the lowlands and the coasts would have had open land, and people would have followed animals onto this land. Eventually, of course, without even knowing it, they entered North America. But while this was happening a long time ago, as early as 20,000 years ago, we have some evidence of humans entering North America. It wasn't until 4,500 years ago that people entered the Arctic. So I should add that it's really hard to find the remains of the first people who traveled over this Bering Bridge, because they probably largely walked over the lowlands and the coastal areas, and those areas are all underwater. So those artifacts that may have been dropped, those stone tools, are tough to find here now. And so that's why sometimes you have very early dates in South America and higher land areas where the remains have not been washed away by rising sea level. Okay, so I'm just going to pop into the next slide. All right, so about 4,500 years ago, a lot of the ice that had existed on the Earth had melted. And so our land bridge became full of holes. There may have been islands in the higher areas, but water was flowing now between the Arctic Ocean and into the into the Pacific from the Atlantic. When we think of the Arctic, we often think of it as a really desolate place. It looks like a frozen desert. It's filled with mammoth-like icebergs and bare, barren, snowy, frozen land. It also appears empty, except for when we encounter a lot of the big and rather scary and dangerous looking animals that live in the Arctic. So you see a polar bear, which is feeding on the ice, feeding on a seal, the walrus, and then underneath you see a picture of muskox and its calf. So these are the kind of strange and wonderful animals that live in the Arctic. So as people who live in the South and enjoy a different kind of environment altogether, we look at this sometimes as a place that we would never want to live, that we can't believe that people would ever choose to live there. And if they went there, that they would stay there for a very, very long time. But actually, this is the case. For the very first Arctic people, it was home for more than 3,000 years. They traveled widely all across the Eastern Arctic, and when they arrived into the Arctic via Alaska, they quickly spread all the way to Greenland. And when we look at radiocarbon dates for how long this took, radiocarbon dates are not perfect. They have, errors of 100 years plus or minus the actual date when something was dropped and then later dated. And so when we look at the travel across the Arctic, it seems to be almost instantaneous. While they were traveling, they got to know places. They camped and lived in places where they hunted and gathered and fished, where they gathered together with their friends and their families, and they had babies. And then at other times of the year, they would have dispersed into small family groups, going to different areas, but they always kept in touch with each other. And part of the reason, and part of the way that we know that people kept in touch with each other, is that we know that they didn't change much of the way that they made their tools. And so we know that they held on to their traditions and that they shared these traditions. We have different names for the first people. Obviously, they are no longer alive. And the Inuit who live in the Arctic today probably saw the last of those people around 900 years ago when the Inuit made their way out of Alaska and into the Arctic. And at that time, the Inuit referred to them as the Tunit people. So I've written that down there at the bottom of the screen. And archaeologists often call them pre-Inuit because they had slightly different traditions. Like the Inuit, they faced a very similar environment. So they ate the same kinds of foods. They gathered many of the same kinds of plants and things. But in some ways, their lives were different. The Tunit were very mysterious because they left nobody behind who could tell us the old stories that might give us more information about who they were and how they lived. But we get clues from the things that they left behind. Because of the mostly frozen conditions, we get to see some of the carvings that they made from materials such as ivory and antler and bone. They had traditions of tattooing that they brought with them from Siberia, which was their former homeland. And we see these in the carvings. So that face that you see, that human face that you see, is actually only about 2 centimeters or about an inch or so tall. And you see the little lines on it. Some people have suggested that it could represent an older individual, but we know from preservation of people in Siberia that in fact this was a style of tattooing. And over on the right, you see 3 very sharp little points. These are points that I found when I was excavating Tunit's site. And it's unlike the kind of needle, the sorts of tools that we see in skin making. So I'm pretty confident that I'm looking at some specialized tattooing needles here. The image, I want to show you some of the other carvings that they made, and they also allow us to get an insight into the way that people may have thought about things. So the image on the left is of a part human, part animal figure. People have suggested that it may be a part wolf. And there is a tradition that goes way back in Siberia where people have a belief that elements of humans exist within animals, and likewise, elements of animals live within humans. The other thing that we find is that they have some carvings, some sort of strange carvings of animals. So the object that you see on the right, I want you to imagine the face of that walrus that we saw a few minutes ago. I'll just take you back. And you just look at that snout there and the little mouth, and then you see those 2 tusks hanging down there. This is the face of 2, this has got 2 walrus faces connecting to each other. The little tusks have broken off both of the walrus faces, but they at one time connected together here in this unusual looking walrus carving. Now we have another object that shows a combination of animals and also of humans. So if you look up at the top of this piece of walrus tusk, and this is the part that would have been inside the jaw of the walrus, you see on the top right and left 2 seals, 2 walruses facing each other, and their tusks are overlapping at the top. And then in between them, there's a little seal. And then, of course, down below, you see a human. So the relationship between animals and humans was often something that was represented in carvings. And it really showed the importance of the relationship between people and animals in the Arctic. So how did they live? The image on the left shows a stone circle. You can see some of the stones are upright, and there seem to be a collection of stones that kind of almost run through the middle of this oval shape. This is a tiny house. It's about 3-4 yards across, or 3.5 meters. And it is on Ellesmere Island, which is in the high Arctic. the very first Arctic people who came here lived in houses that looked like this. And they were hunting a lot of muskox at that time. They were using the bone as fuel, and they were probably keeping the place warm with a little bit of a little tiny fires of burnt bone. But mostly they were staying warm by basically clustering in those houses together. So this is a small house, and it shows you that probably people were on the move in this area as small family units. They would be taking advantage of where they knew to expect to find food, the different animals, and some plants, and for looking for other things that were very important to them. They made many of their tools out of stone, and you'll see that the photograph on the right shows a variety of points. These were used in harpoons and for killing mostly sea mammals in this case. And what you notice is how glassy this stone looks like. It comes in all kinds of different colors. It's really quite beautiful. But the characteristics that make this stone excellent is that they have lots of glass-like minerals in them, including silica. And that allows them to be very easily shaped into anything that those people wanted to make their stone tools from. So one of the things that we know for sure is that there were no fires that included a whole lot of wood. Wood is one of the things that is absent from the Arctic environment, except in locations where you have driftwood coming from further south. And in this case, wood was never burned during that period. It was far too rare and far too important for making tools such as arrows and parts for kayaks and other tools. So it would never have been burned. So one of the important things was for people to understand as much as possible about where animals were, when they would be available, and because of the absence of wood, they had to provide a lot of the other materials. So, for instance, you needed the fat from sea mammals to give you oil that you could burn inside your houses. This was an innovation that came later to the first Arctic peoples. Those early Arctic peoples mostly burned bone, but fat from blubber in sea mammals was really, really useful for lamps, but also, so for keeping warm, but also fat is a great source of fuel in food to keep people warm. Caribou have almost no fat at all, but they provide another couple of important elements to the first Arctic people's needs, and that is antler for making tools. And caribou fur was extremely important for making clothes. Even though lots of clothes were made out of seal skins, which are great because they tend to be pretty waterproof, caribou fur is incredibly warm, much warmer than seal skin. It's got long, hollow, individual hairs. And if anyone ever gets the opportunity to touch a caribou hide, do so with your bare hand and feel right away how the heat comes back and touches your hand. The caribou also would have provided really good hard bone for making tools. And the antler was particularly good for making softer tools that didn't break very easily. The people would have traveled to other places when they knew that things like geese were going to migrate, and they would kill as many of the geese as they could. The geese would have provided them with lots of greasy meat, and sometimes they used the bones to make little needles. Bird bone has really interesting characteristics that make strong, durable needles. So here's a range of different kinds of tools that were made from different materials. In the top left, we have harpoons. And in the middle, you see that image that has the point that you would have seen earlier. It fit into the harpoon head, which was the sort of triangular piece with the hole in the middle and the flares. And then the bottom stick coming out of it was a foreshaft, and that would have been tied to a piece of wood. This tool would have had string tied through the hole. And when a seal was harpooned, this whole harpoon point and head would have entered the animal. When the hunter pulled the cord, the harpoon head would have twisted in the wound, and the seal could have been pulled in and then killed and used for its meat and fur and blubber. Underneath the harpoon heads on the bottom left, you see a variety of little points, and these would have been used for hunting fish and for sparing smaller animals. The larger ones may also have been used to kill caribou. Over on the top right, you see these teeny tiny needles. You can even see the holes in the needles, the eyes. They were used throughout the Arctic and were a very, very important asset because clothing was so important for people in the Arctic. And then I've just popped in two small carvings. One on the left is a seal, and you can see it's got a hole at the bottom. It was probably worn around someone's neck. The little tiny walrus face that you're starting to get to know how the first Arctic people made these faces. This was made out of a burnt piece of whalebone, and on the side on the left, you see one little crease in it, and that's a carved eye. Today in the Arctic, people live in some ways as they did in the past. They still depend on animals, especially for the healthy food that they provide. So right outside this summer camping area on a beach in Cambridge Bay, you see that some char is being air dried. People eat a lot of this good fish in the Arctic, those who live along the coast. And it provides a lot of fat and really good protein. They still also travel over the ice to hunt sea mammals, particularly seals, but sometimes whales who congregate along the edge of the ice in the summer. But one of the problems that's happening today is that the Arctic is changing a lot faster than anywhere else on the planet. And this is really difficult because the Inuit have a huge knowledge of their environment, but the rate of change is so huge now that their knowledge is being challenged every day. And in many cases, they're finding themselves in situations that are not particularly safe. The depletion of sea ice is a huge problem for Inuit hunters who need to go out on the ice to get seal and whales and walrus, for that matter. And they are working with people, with scientists who are also interested in changing ice conditions. And together, the scientists and the knowledge that the Inuit bring to the understanding of this region is helping to fix some of these and to make conditions safe, make them understand where the ice is still remaining heavy and thick enough for them to travel. The Inuit today are still very strongly connected to the land and the sea, and they enjoy very rich lives in this region, and their children are continuing to learn more and more about this environment, and their communities are growing. Even though they're becoming a slightly more westernized, they're still very Inuit in many, many ways. So that was a brief overview, and I'm hoping that you will have some questions for me because I didn't want to take up too much time just talking myself. So thank you for your attention.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Wells. Such a neat talk today. So many comments coming in on YouTube. So we've got over 250, 300 kids tuning in from across the continent. Welcome into all of you live and on YouTube. Patricia, if you want to exit screen share so you can see us, have a bit of a conversation, you can go ahead and do that. I'm going to start with our live classes. I'll come to YouTube. If you're on YouTube and you're a full classroom teacher, let me know where you're joining from. Share your questions there, and we'll take as many as we can. We're going to start in Astoria, New York with this CUMPS class. If you guys want to come on in for our first question, go for it. Go for it.
Hi. Javier has a question. Come here, Javier.
So is everything still okay with my stuff?
Okay, go ahead. So, is there an animal that recently went extinct in the Arctic?
Yeah.
Are there animals that recently went extinct in the Arctic, especially that the Inuit used to hunt?
Yeah.
That's a really good question. I would say, I got to think about that. I am inclined to say no, but I would add that a lot of the Arctic animals are, a lot of the Arctic environment is changing. So some animals are under threat. One thing I'll say about polar bears, for instance, because there's something that a lot of people are quite interested in. Polar bears, they only feed, basically 90% of the eating that they do on the ice. They can't catch seals by swimming after them. And seals make up a huge amount of their diet. So they go from ice pan to ice pan during the summer, and they kill and eat as many seals as they can. They have a great ability to retain a lot of the nutrients from seals, so they can actually go 5 months or more without eating at all and not going into starvation. Unfortunately, because the winters, the summers are coming earlier to the Arctic, the ice is melting earlier. So they are losing access to the seals. And likewise, in the fall, the ice is taking longer to form. So they're having to go a greater length of time without their most reliable source of food, the seals. They are adapting to a certain extent. So they are feeding on whales that have washed up on the shore. And some of the people who hunt whales, particularly in the Western Arctic, are dragging the carcasses away from their communities to ensure that they remain safe, the people there. But they're leaving some of the carcasses for the polar bears. And there have been some photographs of as many as 250 polar bears converging on these scavenging sites, trying to get what they can during the summer to make up for the lack of feeding opportunities on the ice. Other species are not doing too badly. I think that one of the other thing that is happening is that because the climate is changing, caribou are becoming more and more threatened. So while years and years ago, caribou could move across the Arctic and the snow was always frozen, there were no rainstorms. Now we're getting these gigantic rainstorms, and then everything freezes and the surface of the snow is impenetrable because it's covered in ice, and the caribou are losing access. They can no longer dig through that ice to get access to the food. So they are under a great deal of stress. The other thing is that species are moving north, and so there's an effect in terms of the risk of species in the north being exposed to sort of parasites and things that they could get from other animals further south.
Yeah. Thank you for the detailed, nuanced reply, Dr. Wells. That was great. We're going to go to Stavely Elementary and Miss Wheaton's class in Alberta. If you guys have a question for us, come on in.
Hi.
Hi, guys.
Hi, I'm not sure. Can you hear us?
Yeah, you're all, you were all set, and then your tech all died. So we'll come back to you guys in a second. Sorry about that. I'm going to go to Madam G's class. They're joining us right now in Thunder Bay, Ontario. Welcome in Thunder Bay. Hi, Ms. G.
Hi.
Hi.
Hi. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, you're perfect.
We had a couple questions around animals. They wanted to know what the most dangerous animal was or is. And what was our second question with animals? Kaden?
What was the best animal?
Oh, and what was their favorite animal to eat?
Oh, okay. It's a funny thing because you're never sure, but I worked on a site where about 95% of the bones that I found were of seals. So I think that they loved seals, but I wouldn't be surprised if they occasionally got sick of it. And they really enjoyed some fish and some caribou from time to time. But seals and sea mammals were definitely their favorite. I would also add, though, that polar bears were kind of their favorite animal in a way that they had so much, I think, respect for polar bears that many of the carvings that are found in the Arctic are of polar bears. And don't forget, polar bears would have been at the top of the food chain. The polar bears would have been feeding on humans if they had to from time to time.
Yeah. We have done a whole bunch of polar bear programs at Exploring by the Seat of Your Pants. We've run into people where they were very much attempted to be on the food chain and had to make a quick retreat. So I'm glad we got a chance to cover that. Stavely Elementary, I don't know what you pressed, but it killed your computer, but we'll come back. And hi again, guys. If you have a question for us, come on up.
All right, who has a question? Who wants to ask their question? Darren, you have a question? Yeah. Good, come on up. You gotta come up by the camera. You can take your mask off.
When was the Arctic discovered?
Well, the Arctic was discovered about 4,500 years ago when the first people entered the Arctic. If you're asking when did the first Europeans visit the Arctic, well, that's a good question too, because of course, Finland, Norway, Russia, they're all countries that are included in the Arctic. But if your question is who were the first Europeans who visited the Canadian Arctic, then that would be the Norse, the Vikings, as we say often. And they would have been from Norway, and they would have traveled around Greenland and Baffin Island. And also, I'm sitting in Newfoundland, which is one of the few places where they ventured south, where we know for sure they settled for a little while further south.
Yeah. Very cool. All right, we're going to take our question from Miss Nancy's class. They're joining us in BC in Kamloops. Unfortunately, their tech isn't working, so they shared it online. And their question is, where do they get their fresh water? So you talked about all this eating that they're doing. How are they drinking? What are they doing?
Yeah, so they would have been able to get fresh water from snow, of course, but also there would have been lots of streams as well that would have carried water to them. But yeah, so often human settlements are found close to a source of water for obvious reasons. Yeah. Now, one of the things one of the things that's always sort of puzzled me is how they kept from getting sick from drinking water in some of the places where a lot of, say, geese would have landed, and when they would have pooped in the water source. And we know that things don't decompose very quickly in the Arctic, so the bottom of those lakes were probably a bit poopy. So I think probably they were focusing on land-based sources of water and in streams where water would have been nicely filtered. And also they would have adapted to the kinds of parasites that they may have encountered.
Absolutely. Great question, guys. Miss Nancy's class, if you want to share another in the chat bar, please do. I'm going to take a few from YouTube now over the next few minutes, and then we'll dive back in with one more round with our live classes. So Miss McLaren's class, they've been joining us for all sorts of programs this month. They want to know, being from Newfoundland, have you researched Lonsa Meadows? And can you explain a little bit about what that site is all about?
Okay. Well, I already kind of touched on it a minute ago.
Yep.
So the island of Newfoundland is on the northeast coast of Canada. And Lonsa Meadows is a place right up at the northern tip of the island of Newfoundland. So it's actually quite close to the mainland near southern Labrador. There's a settlement there, a Norse settlement, that was first mentioned in the sagas, which are the Norse sort of their historical records, that mentioned a place called Vineland. And two archaeologists, Helga Ingstad and Anna Steen, who were Norwegians, they traveled to Newfoundland. They thought for sure it had to be somewhere around Newfoundland. And when they stopped into a small community called Lonsa Meadows, they asked one of the local men, do you ever see any rectangular formations buried under the ground? Because these would be buried longhouses, buried Norse longhouses. And this man, whose name has just escaped me, but it might come back. He took them straight to a site, and there was a circular arrangement of buried sod houses,
Cool.
and they're about 1,000 years old. So that's the answer.
For all Canadians, if you ever get a chance in your life, Newfoundland in general is a place that's just one of the most magical places in the whole world. But L'Anse aux Meadows is, again, one of the elite historical sites that you can actually go and visit and be a part of in Canada, if not the entire world. So I'd really encourage you guys to check that out and look it up when you're done. I'll bring up a banner so people can see how it's spelled when we're done as well. All right, Ms. Jan's class wants to know, how do they get around during the winter months? If it's dark all the time up in the Arctic, they know that much. How are they traveling?
Well, you know, when we talk about it being dark outside, and it certainly is dark when we're walking under a street light, but for those of you who've ever spent any time at night in the forest, you can look up at the sky. There's moonlight. There's always a bit of ambient light that helps you get around. But for the most part, I think that they generally would have hunkered down. They would have probably eaten a lot of meat that they had stored, but definitely they were going out in the winter and they were hunting animals.
Yeah, very, very cool. All right. And then our question from Mr. Penix's class, Sydney, she's a third grader in North Hollywood. She wants to know a great question. What do they burn if not wood?
Well, they had these little circular lamps about this big, and the lamps are really interesting because the bottom of the lamp, it kind of looks like a bowl, except that the bottom of the bowl is tilted. So they would get a little bit of blubber, which is a solid, and they could make a bit of fire by striking stone and having little bits of dried moss and stuff. So they'd have this little fire that they would get going in the bottom part of the lamp, and they'd put the blubber near the top, and the blubber would start to warm, and the oil would trickle down into the flame, and they would have used a little tiny bit of plant as a sort of wick, and they would have slowly carried some fire down into that. Now, the thing is, they didn't do a lot of burning.
Yep.
So that heated their places, but they would have burned little tiny bits of willow, but the trees in the Arctic are just about a couple of inches high.
Yeah, great question, guys. All right, let's go back to Miss Kump's class in New York. If you guys have another question for us, come on in.
Okay, go ahead, Daniel.
Is COVID-19 affecting the Inuits?
Yeah.
Yes, it is. There has been the COVID virus has reached some parts of the Eastern Arctic in particular. So if you look at your map of the Arctic in Canada, the big bay of Hudson's Bay, which is sort of over in the east, on that western side of Hudson's Bay, in a community called Arviat, that was hit by the COVID virus. So was Iqaluit, which is the main city of Nunavut, which is most of the Eastern Arctic. So we have territories in Canada: Nunavik, Nunatsiavut, Nunavut, Yukon, and so you can see those all on the map. But yes, it has. But luckily, people have followed COVID rules, and it hasn't been as devastating as we were afraid it would be.
Great question, guys. Our obligatory COVID question every program, no matter what we're covering. So thank you guys for that one. Stavely Elementary, if you guys want to come back in, go for it.
Whenabouts in winter does the darkness start through the days?
Yeah.
Yeah, so it's a little bit like I'm not sure where you're calling from, but we kind of live in the north. So as the days get shorter, basically the days start to get shorter after June the 21st. They slowly get shorter. That happens in the Arctic as well. So there's no particular day, but around December the 21st, the sun doesn't come up at all in the Arctic. So the process of the days getting the days getting shorter and the nights getting longer happens faster in the Arctic, but it's a little bit like it happens to the rest of us.
Yeah, great question, guys. All right, we're going to go to Thunder Bay on YouTube, and then we're going to go to Ms. G in Thunder Bay in person. So on YouTube, Ms. Bergamo's class wants to know, how modern is current day society in Iqaluit, in Nunavut? Do people still survive by hunting there today, or what is the situation like?
Well, hunting is an important part of all Inuit society throughout the whole Arctic region. It provides them with a lot of the food that they prefer to eat. Southern food is incredibly expensive. It's expensive to ship up, and in Greenland, for instance, the Danish government subsidizes the cost of shipping fresh food to people in Greenland, and so they have access to less expensive southern food. In the Canadian and the American Arctic, it's a little different for sure. So traditional foods, such as food from the land, continue to be very important. But at the same time, people in the Inuit in Canada, I know everyone's on Facebook. They get around by Skidoo. Yep. They have a lot. They're a real mixture of things. So yeah, they're modern.
That's about it. Some of the programs we've done with the Arctic Institute have highlighted this. So if you want to check out food security in the frozen north, is another great program we did. Some of the other Arctic presentations, and of course, some coming in the months to come. You'll find more answers to some of these great questions. Again, it's been such a thrill having this Arctic Institute series. I'm going to bring up a few quick notes before we go to Ms. G's class for one last question. Again, the Arctic Institute, arctic.ucalgary.ca if you want to see more amazing presentations like today's with Dr. Wells. And Lonza Meadows, we talked about this earlier, so that's how it's spelled on the bottom of your screen. Check that out if you want to learn more about a really amazing site in Canada. Madam G, if you have one more question for us, come on up.
Okay,
Hi.
we have Charlie.
Hi. Go for it.
How did they treat the infected wounds?
How do they clean infected wounds? Great question. Yeah.
Well, I'm not sure how people would have cleaned infected wounds in the past. Because I have no access to that. That sort of information is lost. But I do know that people would have people lived fairly long lives in the past, and they probably cleaned wounds by using things like salt water or any kind of water at all, and possibly staunching, in other words, closing the wounds with skins that they could wrap tightly, maybe some moss, because one of the things about moss is it's quite the sphagnum moss that grows on the ground there is it's quite sterile, so it can keep the infections out.
Yeah. Very, very cool. Dr. Wells, this has been such a real pleasure today. Again, time flies and we're having fun and we're nearing the end of the broadcast. So what I want to do is what we do at the end of every one of our broadcasts, say a huge thank you first and foremost to all our groups joining in on YouTube, over 10 additional classes, 300 plus kids from all across the continent. So welcome in and thank you guys so much. And I'm going to turn it to Miss G and Stavely Elementary's class, our ones remaining before lunch. And if you guys want to join me in saying a big thank you to Patricia today, you are in. Go for it. Thank you so much for joining today, guys, and have a